Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Adapt with Danette FM podcast. I'm Jez FM, the podcast producer, and with me is Danette. Danette, how are you going?
Yeah, really good, Jez. It's a stunning week this week. So I've spent a little bit of time up the back reading this week. And on one day, we had this massive thunder and lightning storm come through. It was spectacular. Next day, bright and sunny. So I've just been enjoying the weather and learning lots.
Fantastic. So today we're going to talk about another thing that has sort of become a bit of a buzzword, but I think it's sort of to do with adapting and lack of adapting and sort of the struggle to kind of keep up. And today we're going to be talking about how leaders can cause burnout and how to avoid it. And you talked to Mark about it. Do you want to tell us any thoughts you had on this topic and talking to Mark?
What I loved about the discussion with Mark is not only did we talk a bit about burnout and how we're often the last person to realize that we are in that state, but you'll notice things like you forget people's names and you know those people. But he also talked about the concept of radical self-care. And we've actually had another discussion with Mark on the Magical Learning podcast about this. So I'd encourage people, if you're interested in that concept, to also go have a listen to that. So radical self-care is really about building your resilience. It's about building your self-awareness, your self-compassion, and self-care so that you're able to look after yourself. And I like Mark's term about remain buoyant. So when you think about resilience, you're sort of going up and down, but he talks about being buoyant. So you sort of go with the flow of whatever's happening and you're able to manage that by remaining buoyant. And he asked a really great question. I'm going to read it word for word so that people can think about this as they're going through this episode. It's, how can I use what I've got in light of the new circumstances? So it's really looking at, what are my strengths, etc. If something new's happening, how do I remain buoyant in that by using what I've already got? So I think that's a really great question to allow us to navigate lots of change, lots of disruption, and not get to burnout.
Absolutely. Well, I don't want to hold us back from the conversation much longer, so let's jump right into it. It's an amazing conversation. So everybody, enjoy Danette's conversation with Mark.
Mark, welcome to Adapt with Danette FM, and super excited to have you on this podcast. Really love for you to introduce yourself to our listeners so they get to learn a little bit about you before we start talking.
Sure. My name is Mark Butler. Hi, everybody. Thank you for tuning in, wherever you are. I'm a mental health specialist, and I have worked with organizations. I don't know. I've been in the corporate space probably 25 years, in the mental health space about 15. Don't add those together and say he's doing all right for 75. They kind of happen side by side. I had the great joy of being able to do that, and the great pleasure and honor, in fact. But what it's done is it's allowed me to work with populations at the really sharp end of challenging environments. So people in recovery from addiction, homelessness, that sort of thing. But also then in a work environment, I spent a lot of time developing programs for, again, high performing teams in that, under that sort of high pressure environment, that need to deliver and need to perform. And we're talking about big first responders, fire, police, etc. But veterans. I've done a lot of work with veterans. And a broad spectrum of people that I've developed treatment programs for in the clinical space, for people who are experiencing trauma, who are experiencing burnout, anxiety, depression, and any of those sorts of conditions, many of them which we still see in the workplace today. So I've kind of had two hats on, if you like, possibly more. So I've been the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. But my favorite place now, I think, is to be the kind of either the fence at the top of the cliff or the wind at the top of the cliff would be even better. So when the pandemic came along, I found myself working in the burnout space a lot more. And I think it was because we shifted, into a whole new way of being. And many of us haven't moved back to the way it used to be, but many teams are now. And so I was in that space, it was all brand new. mental health was an almost taboo conversation pre-pandemic. Now it's very much in the vernacular, which is a good thing. But what I found was we were dealing with people just trying to get by. So burnout became a much bigger conversation. And it still exists today. We haven't gotten very good at it. But at the same time, much of the conversation today now is back again around sort of high-performing teams and sustainable performance, which is part of the sort of burnout and recovery conversation. But it's also something much more again, which feels good. It means like we're sort of, we're getting into that sort of progressive space again. So that's what I do.
Lovely. And what a great introduction, and perfect for leaders who are thinking, or who need to adapt, is because we're going to be constantly adapting, and so being able to make sure that we don't get to the bottom of the cliff, that we're able to stay at the top. I like the wind bit. That was beautiful.
Yes. It's nice to think I am a wind.
I love it.
That's the alternatives to that. Yeah.
Nice.
So, and I think leaders are finding that as well. There's some organizations are back into we need to be back in the office now at least some of the time, and there's resistances to that, and there's sort of acceptance of it. So it's almost like what we did as a business probably hasn't changed. But how we do our business has, and probably won't ever go back to the way it was. There's always going to be some sort of a shift and a dynamic. And then how we adapt to change, and how we transform ourselves and how we transform our businesses is going to make the difference, I think.
Nice, love that. So I'm going to start with the questions, if that's okay.
Sure.
So curious for you, what is it that you do that actually helps you to adapt?
Yeah. It's a good question. Look, for me, adapting, generally speaking, it's around how can I use what I've got in the light of new circumstance, right, or new situations. And for me, I think it speaks generally to resilience, or to my sort of level of buoyancy. Resilience has kind of developed it's kind of an uncomfortableness with some people, and particularly if your audience is in the sort of leadership space, or in the sort of organizational space. Resilience is kind of means that the business wants to squeeze more out of us, and to me that's not what it is at all. Resilience in or anti-fragility, or whatever language we want to use, is about responding positively to adverse conditions, or where we're at. And so to be adaptable and to adapt, you have to be able to sort of rise with the tide. So it's, I think Dr. Paige Williams says, resilience is like, we'll throw you a life belt, but anti-fragility, or resilience 2.0, if you like, we'll teach you how to swim. And I think that's kind of the difference to being adaptable. It's not bouncing back from something we were at. It's actually just kind of going with the flow and going with the tide. So I prefer the phrase buoyancy. And so what do I do around that? I think self-care has got to take a big part of it. And that's my book up over here, my latest one, shameless plug, sorry.
Go for it. Tell them which is your latest one, because you've got so many looking.
There's a few there. Up yours.
I love it.
The pursuit of radical self-care. And I think, to my mind, that's really important when we're talking about being adaptable. Because I think sleep, diet, and exercise, yes, there's a conversation to be had about that. If the engine's not running, we're not going anywhere. But there's so much more to sort of being to our self-care, from a radical, wide-ranging, and from the roots perspective. We in the book I talk about everything like emotional intelligence and resilience, and sort of those sort of areas of adaptability, but also self-awareness, self-compassion. Self-care is part of it, but if we treat it as a chore, then we're never going to lock onto it. But if we're self-compassionate when times are tough, that's a mindset that I think we all need to have. And so it does speaks to, then, what do I do to sort of help me to adapt? I think it's focusing and keeping a close eye on what I do for my own self-care.
Nice. What a great answer. And
Oh, thanks.
yeah, love that. And no shameless plug. That I love the name of the book, and I totally agree with the concept. So yeah,
Thank you.
I'm sure
Yeah.
we're going to have other conversations around this.
Sure.
Yeah, because I love it.
Love
so
to.
I'm curious in terms of, yeah, part of adaptability is there's going to be times when things don't work because people will be experimenting with new ideas and therefore, dealing with failure, although I don't really think of it as failure. But I'm curious, how do you deal with failure when things don't go according to plan? What do you do?
My sort of instinctive thing is to retreat. And I guess it depends on how I'm viewing the failure. Was it something I did, or is it just something that's happened? If it's something I did, I would probably put my hand up and say I retreat. And it might be and I'm thinking this through now, as I say, because it's not a question I get asked very often. If something is kind of as a result of something I've done or said or experienced, and I'm feeling that sort of I'm feeling a failure as opposed to something has failed, then there's a kind of a shame kind of attachment to that. And I remember someone I studied under once, I asked them, we were talking about opposites. What's the opposite of good, bad? What's the opposite of poor, rich? What's the opposite of light, darker? And they said, what's the opposite of shame? And I think I said pride, probably. And I said, potentially. And I said, well, what do you think the opposite of shame is? And they said, belonging. And I thought,
I like
that's
that.
interesting.
Mm.
And I said, because when we're shamed, we do retreat. And we disconnect, disengage. Very similar to loneliness, very similar, insular people will do that. Introverts to a degree, maybe. Retreat just to recover and just to sort of stabilize again. But and I think I'm a bit more extroverted. But so I think when I experience failure, I tend to retreat and lick my wounds myself. And so that's the opposite of belonging. Then I disconnect and disengage. If it's failure that's not my fault, I'm generally a bit more adaptable to it and will rise and go, okay, well, where's the opportunity in here? We need to keep driving forward. But I think there's an instinctive thing sometimes to just look after myself and, good sleep and tomorrow will be better, sort of thing.
Nice. Love that. Love that answer. And that distinction too between, is it something I've created or something that's sort of external is a really important point.
Particularly around the self-critic,
Oh, yeah.
Is it my fault? And the self-critic is really interesting. We're speaking now at about 170 words a minute, something like that, right?
Yep.
We can type at 200 words a minute. I type at about 30 because I'm using the delete and return buttons pretty much 50% of the time, hunt and peck typing kind of thing. But our self-critic, we know, speaks to us at a rate of about 600 words a minute, because we don't actually have to finish sentences, because we kind of know what we're talking about, right? When we're beating ourselves up. But the other really interesting thing with that is when we're in full fight or flight mode, or we're in a panic attack or something, that speed can get up to, it's been measured at 4,000 words a minute.
Wow.
That's an awful lot of self kind of abuse and
conflict.
Plus, when you add to that we're more in conversation with ourselves than all other conversations combined. So, when we allow ourselves to speak to ourselves like that, particularly in the areas of failure or shame, the message can be very, very loud and quite harmful.
So what can, I'm sure our listeners would love to know, what are some simple things they can do to quieten that self-critic?
Yes. If we were all that good at it, it probably wouldn't exist, because it is a kind of it's an instinctive survival technique, that that internal fight or flight response. Our brain doesn't know the difference between danger and stress, and it also doesn't know the difference between a memory of an event and the actual event itself happening. So we get that sort of keep us safe instinctive sort of action, and it served us well as a species. We're still here, so we can't kind of badmouth it really too much. But and the self-critic is part of that. But I think there's an expert in self-compassion. Her name is Dr. Kristen Neff, Neff, and I really like her work. She's been an expert in self-compassion for a number of years now. She's kind of the Brené Brown of self-compassion, if you like.
Oh, yes.
If you know Brené Brown.
Yes.
Maybe not as dynamic as Brené, so maybe not as sort of famous, but has a beautiful message. And basically, like, she's kind of saying, look, self-compassion means we speak to ourselves the way we would speak to somebody else, or the way we would like someone to speak to us, and it takes practice. Somebody else recently said, you know, if someone spoke to your kids the way you speak to yourself, you'd probably be in jail for what you do to them, you know. And it's true. It's true. We're so nasty to ourselves.
Yeah.
But Kristen Neff's idea is that, you know, there's this sort of common humanity. If you remember that there's 8 billion of us around now, and, you know, when you think about it, maybe 1 in 5 is experiencing optimal mental health at any given time. Nobody experiences it all the time. So 4 out of 5 people are beating ourselves up on some level for something.
Yeah.
And so when we think about that, the common humanity of that, we're all in this together. We're all experiencing what it is. We're not alone. And you know, it's not new. This has been around since time began. And, you know, just go easy on ourselves. And you can give yourself a pat on the hand and say, it's going to be okay. It'll be all right. Physically, that, you know, that we experience that feeling. Giving yourself a hug does actually sort of land. So it's about sort of getting better at being able to do that, and just go, you know what, today I feel, sorry for swearing, I feel shit, but today I'm just going to continue to feel that way, and tomorrow I'll change my mindset. It's okay to kind of retreat and know it for what it is. Don't make it any bigger than it is, and just go. Look, loads of people right this minute are feeling exactly how I'm feeling about their own circumstance. It's okay. So if we can get into that mindset, we can get there. Here's a beautiful example of that, actually. And I know this came up in a conversation before that we've had. What would you say to your younger self?
Yes. Love that one.
Yeah, it's a great question, isn't it? And when I've worked with people in recovery from addiction, I'm talking long time recovery, long time addiction, people in a 12-month program. And I would ask them that question, you know, what would you say to your 18-year-old or 20-year-old self? And usually it's always around, you know, I'd say, don't pick up drugs and don't drink and don't do this and don't do that. And it's very punitive and very sort of finger wagging. But then I had the absolute honor of working with a team of gay men experiencing HIV or AIDS for at least 10 years.
Wow.
And it was a 2-day sort of retreat. And when I was asked to do it, I thought, parallel kind of lifestyle or a parallel group of people I don't have a great connection with, but they said, you know, their self-care is gone. They're not very self-caring. They, you know, they do a lot of harm. And I said, all right, okay. So I arrived to sort of talk about the basics of self-care like I would talk to somebody in recovery, only to discover that I had never met a group of people, particularly men, who were so self-aware, self-compassionate, and self-caring as these group of men. And here I am trying to teach them around the basics of self-care. And I said, listen, I'm trying to teach the 9 times tables to a group of mathematicians. I had no idea. I was told this was the topic that we would be discussing. And, you know, to their credit, they sat with me for the first day, and nearly all of them came back the second day. And at which point I said, what should we talk about? What do we do? Anyway, the question came up, and look, the context of this was I was asking a group of people who have been prejudiced and they have been discriminated against and worse in their own community than ours in many respects, interestingly enough.
Wow.
And who have lived with a disease or disorder that has been sort of frowned upon since it came in. Less so now, but, you know, it's still there. And I said, what would you say to your 18 or 28-year-old self? And I was kind of half expecting the be careful sort of conversation. Every single one of them said, it's okay, you're going to be all right.
Wow. Isn't that extraordinary? Wow.
I thought it was amazing. From people who have experienced what they've experienced to the depths and the levels that they have. There's, in spite of all of that, you're going to be all right. This will be okay. I still get goosebumps when I sort of think of it and remember being there.
Yeah, wow.
And it's taught me something. So what would I say to myself now? I think probably the same. You know?
I love that.
Okay, you'll manage. Figure it out. You know? I'm not going to rescue or save you. I'm not going to rob you of your experience of being an 18 or 20-year-old. Are there things that I regret? Oh my God, yeah. Who hasn't, right?
Exactly.
But I think the message that, you know what, just experience and go through it, it'll be fine. You'll be okay. Very, very solid message in there, I thought.
Love it. Love it. Awesome. So I'm curious because, you've got the burnout expertise as well. And this would be helpful, I think, for listeners to sort of start to know what are some of the indicators that they're heading towards burnout and sort of what are the implications if they don't pay attention?
Right. Sorry.
No, you've been talking, so I've given the conversation to you.
Thank you very much.
You need to liquidate.
The traditional model of burnout has kind of three domains. If you can kind of picture a Venn diagram in front of my face here now. And the first element or the first domain of burnout is what we call exhaustion. And that'll be physical, mental, or emotional exhaustion. Insider tip, probably emotional exhaustion is the one that will manifest.
Yep.
The second domain, this is the traditional model of burnout. Now, Christine Maslach, Michael Leiter, World Health Organization, this is all their stuff.
Yep.
The second sort of domain or mode of burnout talks about, they call it efficacy. It's an academic word, not a fan. It's much more, I think, around ability. So in other words, our ability to do our best work starts to slip away. Yep. For me, when I burnt out first, it was names. Just people I worked with, either side of me, could not think of their names. And it's one of the first signs for me when I start forgetting the names of my friends and stuff that I go, all right, retreat time. Other people will, simple arithmetic, they'll forget dates and deadlines. They'll forget meeting appointments. That one I spoke to the other day, he wrote the word picnic, Picknick, and he could not tell what was wrong with it. But he's staring and going, I know it's not right.
Yep.
But I don't know what it is. So that sort of ability, and people who've had COVID and have experienced the brain fog have a bit of an idea of what that might be like now. And even the most passionate person can still experience that, and then it's ultimately frustrating. But then the third element of burnout that they acknowledged was one they called cynicism. So if you're picturing the diagram, there's exhaustion, there's the ability or efficacy, and then there's cynicism. And that's kind of mental jadedness, if you like, and disengagement that starts to appear. And the definition kind of sat uncomfortably with me for some time. And the reason I kind of worked, it took me a while to figure it out. There was something missing, and there was something funny about cynicism. And what I realized was this cynicism, even though it's a kind of an identifier of burnout, it's actually a coping strategy. It's a survival instinct.
Yeah, true.
Right?
Wow.
Because misery loves company. Yes. We hate being in that awful place on our own. So we will try to recruit others into the space. First of all, for the company, but secondly, and more importantly, to validate the feelings that we've got. We don't want to be the only one experiencing this. So we will look for others. And then that manifests in the workplace as gossip. So when you start to hear that sort of disparaging gossip and talking down the boss or the leaders or the business or the team or the organization or the clients, that stuff spreads, right? It's the only part. It's the only part of burnout, I think, that's contagious. Mental ill health is not contagious.
Yes.
But that gossipy sort of cynicism is.
Yeah.
And yet it's an externalization of what I'm feeling. You know, I'm looking for others that are experiencing the same thing. I'm blaming everything around me. So I thought that there's a couple of things missing with burnout. And so I've added, here's another circle to our Venn diagram. Now there's 4 circles. Exhaustion, yeah. Efficacy, awful word, replace it with ability. I think cynicism, because it's externalizing it all and looking for something to blame, you know, it's like people in recovery from addiction. If they relapse, there's 10 things that happen that cause it, and it's never my fault, but all of this stuff, you know, and we become sort of empathetic to that. But so I call that sort of, it's much more around apathy, I think, than cynicism. And it's just, all right, I give up. I'm at the end. I'm done. But the 4th element, what was missing from that burnout model, to my mind, there's no mention of mental ill health anywhere in there. And so when we're in that chronic stress space, or we're in that apathetic space, or we're hugely passionate, but we just can't get the work out anymore, and we're just tired all the time, that will lead to mental health challenges like anxiety and depression, sometimes perfectionism, again, which is a kind of an anxiety. Procrastination, again, a kind of an anxiety base, right? Yes. So it was never brought up as an element of burnout. So, but I've added it into my sort of programs. So those are the things to look for.
Yep.
And really, when you think about burnout, what causes it? And I'm not talking about, you know, excessive workloads or, you know, lack of clarity. These are very valid things. But to the individual, when we suppress our emotions, that's when we're going to find it.
Yeah. Yep.
You know, I'm tired, or I'm beating myself up because I should be able to do this. And if the team can keep up, why can't I? And all of that stuff. So the self-critic, welcome back. Oh, you never left. Right? Yes. You were just hiding, waiting till I was at my weakest, you know. But all of those things, we're suppressing our emotions. We're suppressing that sort of full range of what's happening for us. And when we do that, we allow all of this stuff to happen to us. So it's all connected, isn't it? Emotional intelligence, empathy, self-compassion, you know, the results of which are very often burnout. Boundaries, we lack boundaries. We take on too much. We can't say no. Burnout, you know, so it's all in there.
Nice. I love your model. It's gorgeous. So thank you. And I agree with adding that extra circle to the Venn diagram, which I don't know what you call it when there's 4 of them.
I know. Is it a quadrant, or is it just a 4-part Venn diagram? We just invented it.
So, Mark, I'd love for, because we're sort of coming to the end, but is there anything else you'd like to share? You know, so leaders who are trying to adapt, you know, anything that from your, you know, your years of experience, obviously what you do, anything that you think might help leaders to not only be able to adapt once, but be able to remain adaptable as well?
Yes. I think it is raising our levels of emotional intelligence. And that starts with us. And sometimes it's kind of woo-woo conversation, you know. Here's the reality about our emotions and feelings. Behind every action, or underpinning every action or every behavior, is a feeling, which is an emotion, right? Yep. And behind or underpinning every one of those feelings or emotions is a yearning or a need or a want or a desire. We're fulfilling some kind of a desire that has resulted in this kind of feeling or emotion that then leads us to taking some kind of behavior or action. So when you think of it like that, look for the yearning, you know, rather than focusing on the sort of emotion. Understand that we're feeling emotions and that we don't always recognize them, but let's find out how to stop suppressing them. And when we're good at just, first of all, regulating ourselves, actually, I think it begins with recognizing them. Get out of here and into here, see what we're feeling. I'm agitated. I don't know why. Maybe I don't need to know why. I just need to know I'm agitated. And so I need to take a break, or I need to, you know, get something to eat, or I need whatever it is, meeting that need. when we get good at that, then we can get good at regulating them. And when we get good at regulating our emotions so they don't overwhelm us, we're in control of our emotions rather than them controlling us. We can kind of start to see it in other people as well. And as a leader, when you have a high degree of emotional intelligence and a decent level of empathy, and we could have another conversation about empathy. It's really interesting. It's tribal.
Totally.
It can be dangerous. Compassion is not always the right answer. We're robbing people of an experience that's not always right either, rescuing and saving. But we could have a whole conversation about all of that. But I would say to leaders, just tune in what's going on. Don't suppress it so that you don't experience that burnout. And therefore, when you have that higher level of emotional intelligence, you are far more valuable to your organization, to your team. You develop the reputation of being a caring leader. Caring leaders don't get accused of bullying, the number one fear of leaders. Right?
Interesting.
So, yeah. And Travis Bradbury and Jean Greaves' research says that, and they measure this internationally and across every management or leader level and many industries and sectors. They said about 10 years ago, empathetic or emotionally intelligent leaders earn about $29,000 US, which is about $40,000 Australian a year more than someone with a less level of emotional intelligence. 98% of founders recognize emotional intelligence as more important than IQ. EQ is more important to them than IQ.
Totally agree.
Yeah, get good at this. And I get asked a lot, can you teach emotional intelligence? You can, or you can guide people back to their own, because we're all born with it. It's a survival strategy. It's it's a basic necessity that we can integrate with other people and recognize what's going on in the team. It's how we keep safe. So we're born with it. I don't know. Look at any baby; they don't deny their emotions, and they'll let you know.
Totally
let you know. But somewhere along the way, then we're kind of taught to suppress them and ignore them and bypass them, etc. And I think the time has come. Got to let them out again. They'll bring the self-critic with them, but that's all right. If we can learn to talk to that as well.
Hopefully, it can go as well then.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, at least we kind of get used to it, and we can talk back to it, and tell it to cut us a break.
Love that.
So that's kind of where I think it's at. I think emotional intelligence is hugely important. Be careful of empathy. It's, as I said, it's tribal. I'm going to care much more about my people than your people. I'm going to care more about the ones who are in the office than the ones who work remotely. This areas like that, we just got to be, those kind of unconscious biases that we might have. And the same thing with compassion. Just be careful. Are you rescuing or saving, or are you supporting? A big difference between the two. Yeah. Random acts of kindness, I think, are the number one thing of developing our empathy. Do something nice for someone. Just don't tell them. You can't tell them that you've done it.
I love that. And what a beautiful ripple effect too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Love it. Well, Mark, thank you so much for being on this podcast.
My absolute pleasure, Danette.
We will include information so our listeners can reach out to you if they'd like to learn more about you, and absolutely would recommend that they have a look at your books as well as your programs.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
All right, what a great conversation that was. And also, I think I forgot to mention at the top, but this is a companion podcast to the book The Adaptable Leader by Danette Fenton-Menzies, which goes into this and much more. So we encourage people, if you're loving this podcast, go check that out. You're going to love it. Both Danette infused, so they've all got Danette's essence, so it's they're great together. Danette, how did you find this conversation with Mark?
I love this conversation. I see many people when there's lots of change happening, moving towards burnout, as Mark was talking about. And really, this is a way, particularly Mark's radical self-care, is a way of being able to counteract that and be sustainable, both as a leader and a fellow worker.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, as always, we've got a listener question. So today we had a bit of a longer one. So this one's from Laura S. And I think this is a great question because it kind of taps into sort of a slightly different thing about burnout. So Laura's question was, I'm struggling with finding any sort of creativity in art for the past few months. I can't get anything on paper. Whenever I draw, even if it's visually good, I can feel that there's no motivation or feeling behind it. What's wrong with me? Am I just burnt out? So I guess this is just burnout, not only in the work context, but how it can affect you kind of outside of work.
Yep. And Laura, I always start by saying this might be where you need to talk to a medical professional. Certainly things like burnout, that's definitely not something I could, make a call on. And I think for all of us, I know certainly in Australia, going to see people for medical help, you go to your doctor and you're like, yeah, that's normal. A lot of people have challenges going to talk to therapists, psychologists, etc. And yet these are people helping you with your mental health. So I would absolutely recommend, it's just like going to the doctors, go and see someone if you're feeling flat. There may also be medical reasons why you haven't got that energy. If you're sort of all clear in terms of your physical health and you've perhaps worked with a mental health professional, I look at things like, are you doing that self-care that Mark talked about? And I love that concept of radical self-care. So again, it's around building our resilience, building our self-awareness to get to know what works for us, what doesn't, building our self-compassion, because often when we go down, we tend to beat ourselves up. So Mark talked about the self-critic and how much it talks. I think he said it was something like 4,000 words a minute it goes into our head. So, that could also be, you're probably doing great work and maybe testing it with someone who's not you, because that self-critic's probably talking you down. The other thing is obviously working on your self-care. I'd also say, are you doing other things that are fun, that just bring that spark out in you? And sometimes we lose that fun and that enjoyment when we start to feel a bit down. So I'd absolutely encourage you to have a look at that. Mark's written a great book. I like to self-promote my books, but I also love to promote all of those that come on my podcast too. And I love his title, which is called Up Yours. So I highly recommend that. He has given us a link to that, so you can download it because he wants to share the great work that he does. And I think, sometimes I've noticed I tend to sort of lose my resilience when I start stripping away the things that are important to me to help others. And I get to the point where I've stopped helping myself, and then I get a bit resentful. So if you're sort of getting a bit resentful, people are starting to maybe piss you off, you want to throw your phone, etc., maybe it's time to come back to that radical self-care and really invest in yourself for a little while. And don't forget to smile. Maybe get out and look at the stars at night, bring a bit of awe into your life. All of that could help too. But please reach out to your medical professionals because that's definitely where I would start.
Yes, absolutely. And I actually, this is so interesting. This has brought back a memory from the first podcast I ever listened to, probably back in 2009 or 2008 or something, which involved actor Ben Schwartz. And this is just talking about burnout a little bit and what you were saying, which is that sometimes you need to mix things up. He's gone on to do a lot of different Hollywood films, but he was saying he was working as an improviser, and he was doing improv every day. And the thing that his coach said to him was just do anything else, like go to the zoo or something, just to break up the pattern and to give you more to draw from. So if you feel like I think also sometimes creativity, it can be hard if you are tight on time, but giving yourself the opportunity to experience new things gives you a new sort of, I guess, energy to create new and interesting things.
And actually, Jez, you've just reminded me, recently I did a book review on Steal Like an Artist, and that may also have some useful tips. It's got 10 different approaches, and the steal is not literally steal someone else's work, but it's actually, when we see apprentice artists, they are often drawing the masters or painting the masters' paintings, etc. But then they develop their own style, and definitely one of the tips they had in the Steal Like an Artist book was, get out and do other things for that very reason. Your brain gets bored.
All right, fantastic. Danette, did you have any final thoughts today on the conversation or burnout and how to avoid it as a leader?
Yeah. So, a critical thing of being a sustainable, adaptable leader is that you need to invest in you and your self-care every day, because it's really hard to give if you're running on fumes. So I love Mark's concept of radical self-care, not just about doing the exercise, the sleep, etc., but having that self-awareness, also that self-compassion, super, super important. Thanks, Jez.
Amazing. Well, thanks everybody for sharing and listening. We'll be back next week with another amazing conversation. But until then, have a magical week.
Bye, everyone.